5 dangerous men cornered a billionaire in a dark alley. But just when it seemed his life was over, a poor little boy with nothing but a rubber ball stepped forward. What happened next shocked everyone, and changed both of their lives forever. Let's continue this story. The night was darker than usual, the kind of darkness that makes even the bravest man quicken his steps. The billionaire, Richard Hayes, adjusted his expensive coat as he cut through a narrow alley, thinking it would save him time. He had no idea that decision would change his life forever. Out of the shadows, 5 men emerged, their faces rough and their eyes hungry for trouble. "Look what we have here," one of them sneered, stepping closer. Richard froze. For all his wealth, for all the bodyguards and security he usually had, tonight he was alone, and he knew he was trapped. The men circled him, their footsteps echoing against the damp brick walls. His heartbeat raced as one thug shoved him against the wall, growling for his wallet and watch. Richard, who was worth billions, felt more powerless than he ever had. Fear crawled up his spine as he realized no one would hear him if he screamed. But just as one of the men raised a fist to strike, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Hey, leave him alone." The attackers turned their heads toward the sound. Standing at the mouth of the alley was a skinny black boy, no older than 11 or 12, clutching a worn rubber ball in his small hands. His knees were scraped, his jacket too big for his frame, but his eyes burned with courage far beyond his age. The men laughed cruelly at the sight. "What's this? A kid come to save the rich guy?" one mocked. Another added with a sneer, "Run along, boy, before you get hurt." But the boy didn't move. His knuckles tightened around the ball, and his voice rose again, steady and fierce. "I said leave him alone." Richard's heart twisted. He didn't know why this child was standing up for him, someone he'd never met. But in that instant, he saw something in the boy's stare: defiance, bravery, and maybe even desperation. The men, amused, decided to make a game of it. "You want to be a hero, huh? What are you going to do with that ball, kid? Play catch." They erupted into laughter. But the boy didn't laugh. He narrowed his eyes, drew back his arm, and with a speed and precision no one expected, hurled the ball. It struck the leader of the group squarely in the temple with a loud crack. The man staggered, cursing, his balance thrown off. Shock rippled through the alley. For a split second, everyone froze. Then chaos exploded. The boy darted forward, scooped up the ball as it bounced, and threw again, this time at another attacker's face. The ball slammed into his nose, and blood sprayed as the thug stumbled back with a howl. Richard's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing. This child, this fragile-looking boy, was fighting off 5 grown men with nothing but a rubber ball and sheer determination. The attackers, now furious, lunged at the boy, but he was quick, dodging and weaving with the instincts of someone who'd been forced to survive on tough streets. He bounced the ball off the ground and sent it flying into another man's knee, making him collapse with a groan. Richard, adrenaline surging, realized he couldn't just stand there. For the first time in years, he felt powerless money couldn't help him, but maybe courage could. Still, he was too stunned to move, caught between fear and awe as the boy fought. The alley echoed with shouts, the thud of the ball, and the grunts of angry men being outsmarted by a child. In the brief moments between throws, Richard noticed the boy's trembling hands, the sweat beading his forehead, and yet, he didn't back down. It wasn't just bravery. It was something deeper, as if this fight was about more than just saving a stranger. As the men regrouped, one spat, "You're dead, kid." The boy picked up his ball again, chin lifted high. "Not today." And he flung it harder than ever. Richard finally snapped into action. He grabbed a loose piece of wood from the ground, ready to swing if anyone got too close. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about deals, stocks, or power. He was thinking about survival, and about this boy who had already risked everything to protect him. The clash was far from over, but one thing was clear: this wasn't going to be a simple mugging anymore. The boy had changed everything. The thugs regrouped, their laughter gone, replaced by snarls of anger. One of them, a muscular man with tattoos snaking up his arms, lunged toward the boy. The child's eyes darted to the ground, and just as the thug reached him, he bounced the ball hard against the pavement and snapped it back up in one fluid motion, slamming it into the man's jaw. The crack echoed, and the attacker fell back with a groan, clutching his face. "What is this kid made of?" another growled, shaking his head in disbelief. Richard's pulse hammered. He wanted to run, but something inside him whispered that running wasn't an option anymore. If he bolted, they'd finish the boy first. And somehow, Richard couldn't let that happen. He tightened his grip on the wooden plank he'd picked up, his knuckles whitening. He was a billionaire, a man used to controlling boardrooms and commanding respect. But here in this filthy alley, it was an 11-year-old boy who was teaching him what real courage looked like. The leader, his temples still throbbing from the earlier hit, snarled at the child. "Enough games. Break his legs." Two of the men advanced on the boy from opposite sides. Richard's heart stopped. The boy couldn't dodge them both. Then, in a move so quick it seemed impossible, the boy dropped to one knee, slammed the ball on the ground, and sent it ricocheting off the wall. It bounced high, smacking one thug in the back of the head before bouncing again into the stomach of the other. Both men doubled over in pain, coughing and swearing. The boy scrambled to snatch up the ball again, panting, sweat streaking his face. Richard saw his chance. Summoning strength he didn't know he still had, he swung the plank at the nearest thug. The wood cracked against the man's shoulder, and he stumbled with a roar of pain. Richard's arms shook from the impact, but something inside him, adrenaline, or maybe pride, kept him standing. The boy threw him a glance, eyes wide with surprise, then a small nod of approval. They were fighting together now, an unlikely pair, a billionaire and a street kid. But the fight was far from won. The leader, angrier than ever, reached into his pocket and pulled out a switchblade. The metallic click echoed in the alley, freezing the moment. Richard's stomach dropped. This was no longer about intimidation or robbery. If they didn't end this soon, someone was going to die. The boy's eyes flickered to the knife, then back to Richard. His hands trembled, but he didn't back away. He raised the ball again, his jaw set. "Kid," Richard muttered, his voice shaking, "you don't have to do this. Run while you can." The boy didn't even glance at him. "I'm not leaving you." His tone was firm, unshakable. Richard felt his chest tighten. No one had said words like that to him in years. Most people stuck around for his money. This child was risking his life, for him. The leader lunged, blade flashing under the dim streetlight. The boy ducked and launched the ball with every ounce of strength in his small frame. It smashed into the man's wrist, knocking the knife loose. The weapon clattered to the ground. Richard, acting on pure instinct, kicked it away before anyone could grab it. The other thugs hesitated, shocked by how badly a little boy was dismantling them. "You're all pathetic," the leader spat, clutching his wrist in pain. "5 grown men, and you can't take down a kid?" His voice was dripping with venom. The men, humiliated and bleeding, started to falter. One muttered, "This isn't worth it, man. Let's go." But pride held them in place. The boy bounced the ball against the ground, a sharp, steady rhythm, his gaze never leaving them. It was a warning. He wasn't done yet. Richard, still shaking, couldn't help but wonder who this boy was. Why was he out here in the middle of the night? Why was he so fierce, so unwilling to let go? This wasn't just bravery. There was history behind those eyes, scars invisible to the world but written deep inside. The standoff stretched, the air thick with tension. Finally, the leader roared and charged again, his pride too wounded to retreat. But this time, Richard didn't wait. Fueled by the boy's example, he stepped forward and swung the plank with every ounce of strength left in him. It struck the thug's ribs, sending him crashing to the ground. The boy followed instantly, slamming the ball into the man's forehead to make sure he stayed down. Silence fell. The other men looked at their leader sprawled on the pavement, groaning in pain, and something in their faces cracked. Fear replaced fury. One by one, they backed away, muttering curses. Then they turned and fled, leaving the alley in stunned quiet. The only sounds left were Richard's ragged breathing and the soft bounce of the ball against the boy's palm. For a long moment, neither spoke. Richard leaned against the wall, chest heaving, while the boy wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked exhausted, but his eyes still carried that same fire. Richard finally broke the silence. You saved my life." His voice cracked, the words heavier than he expected. The boy shrugged, almost embarrassed. They were wrong. Somebody had to stop them. Richard stared at him, overwhelmed. He had more questions than he could count, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a story far bigger than he'd ever imagined. The alley was quiet now, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavy in the air. Richard leaned against the cold brick wall, his expensive coat torn, his hands trembling as he tried to steady his breath. He looked at the boy again, really looked at him this time. The child's shoes were worn, the soles barely holding together. His jacket was at least 3 sizes too big, frayed at the edges, and his little hands were rough, as if he'd worked harder in his short life than most men ever would. But it wasn't his clothes or his scraped knees that struck Richard the most. It was his eyes. Fierce, unyielding, and yet carrying a sadness that spoke of nights without safety, days without ease. "What's your name, kid?" Richard finally asked, his voice soft but unsteady. The boy looked down, bouncing the ball once against the cracked pavement before catching it again. "Malik," he muttered. The name carried strength, though the boy said it quietly, as if he wasn't used to people asking or caring. Richard repeated it under his breath, "Malik," and felt something stir in his chest. "Why did you help me?" Richard asked, genuinely puzzled. He had billions. He could buy his way out of almost anything. But this boy, with nothing but a ball, had just saved him in a way money never could. Malik glanced at him, then shrugged. "Because nobody else would. People like them, they think they can hurt whoever they want. I'm tired of it." His voice cracked slightly, but his jaw tightened. He had the look of someone who had seen far too much already. Richard's throat tightened. He thought of his own life, filled with private jets, mansions, and people who only stayed close because of his wealth. When was the last time someone had stood beside him out of pure loyalty? He couldn't remember. "You're brave," Richard said. The word felt too small, too simple, but it was all he could find. Malik looked away, mumbling, "Brave doesn't keep you fed." That line hit Richard harder than any blow he'd taken that night. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but Malik suddenly stiffened, his eyes darting toward the end of the alley. Richard followed his gaze and froze. 2 of the thugs who had run away earlier were standing there, lurking just beyond the streetlight, glaring back at them. They weren't done. They were regrouping, maybe waiting for reinforcements. Richard's stomach dropped. "They're coming back," he whispered. Malik nodded, gripping his ball tighter. "They won't stop easy. You should go." Richard blinked at him, stunned. "Go? And leave you here alone?" Malik met his eyes with a stubborn fire. "I've been alone my whole life. I know how to handle people like them. You don't." The words cut deep. Richard, who had conquered financial empires, was being told he didn't know how to survive a back alley fight. And the worst part was, it was true. But he couldn't accept leaving Malik behind. Something inside him refused. He shook his head. "No, I'm not going anywhere without you." Malik blinked, as if he hadn't expected that answer. For a moment, the tough mask cracked, and Richard glimpsed the boy beneath. The child who'd never been protected, who probably had no one to lean on. Malik swallowed hard and finally nodded. "Then we'd better move. If they bring more guys, we won't win." Richard straightened, his body aching but his determination burning. Together, they stepped cautiously out of the alley. The city around them was alive with distant honks, neon lights, and the hum of nightlife. But for Richard, everything felt sharper, more fragile. He was a man used to boardrooms and luxury cars, but here he was, standing shoulder to shoulder with a child, uncertain of what would happen next. As they walked, Richard tried to piece together who Malik really was. "Where's your family?" he asked carefully. Malik's shoulders stiffened, and he stared straight ahead. "Don't have one," he muttered. "Not anymore." Richard opened his mouth to press, but the boy shot him a look so raw, so full of warning, that he stopped. He didn't need details to know the truth. Malik's life had been carved by loss, abandonment, and survival. They rounded a corner, and Richard's luxury car came into view, gleaming under the streetlight like it didn't belong in this part of town. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly shadowed by another thought. What would happen to Malik if he just drove away? He couldn't shake the image of the boy standing alone again, clutching his ball, facing a world that had never been kind to him. Richard reached for his keys, then hesitated. He turned to Malik. "You can't stay out here. Not tonight. Come with me." Malik frowned, suspicious. "With you? What?" Richard took a breath, trying to find the right words. "Because you just saved my life. Because I don't want to leave you out here. And because," he hesitated, his voice dropping, "because I think you deserve better than this." Malik looked at him long and hard, bouncing the ball slowly, his expression unreadable. He had lived a life where trust was dangerous, where promises were often broken. But something about the billionaire's tone, the raw sincerity in his eyes, made him pause. Finally, he gave a small nod. Just for tonight. Richard smiled faintly, relief flooding through him. Just for tonight, he echoed. But deep down, he already knew this was more than one night. This was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, something that would change them both forever. The leather interior of Richard's car smelled faintly of polish and wealth, a sharp contrast to the dusty alleys they had just escaped. Malik slid into the passenger seat cautiously, his small hands never letting go of the scuffed ball. He looked around wide-eyed but tried hard not to show his wonder. Richard started the engine, the quiet purr filling the silence between them. For a few moments, neither spoke, the city lights reflecting off the windshield as they drove. Richard glanced at Malik from the corner of his eye. The boy sat stiffly, alert, as if ready to bolt at any second. "You don't have to be scared," Richard said softly. Malik shot him a sharp look. "I'm not scared." The words were defensive, almost automatic. Richard gave a small smile. "I didn't mean it like that. I just meant, you're safe now. With me." Malik didn't answer, but his grip on the ball loosened just a little. They drove through the glittering streets until they reached Richard's towering glass condo. The doorman's eyes widened when he saw Richard step out with a ragged boy at his side, but Richard silenced him with a glance. Malik, head tilted back, stared up at the skyscraper that seemed to touch the clouds. "You live here?" he whispered. Richard chuckled. "For now, yes." Malik muttered under his breath. "Looks like a palace." Inside, the marble floors gleamed, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Malik's sneakers squeaked awkwardly as he followed Richard into the private elevator. When the doors opened to Richard's penthouse, Malik froze. The space was massive, filled with floor-to-ceiling windows, modern art, and furniture that probably cost more than he could imagine. He shuffled inside, his eyes darting everywhere. This isn't real," he whispered. Richard watched him quietly, suddenly aware of how meaningless all of it felt in comparison to what had just happened in that alley. Richard guided him to the kitchen. "Hungry?" he asked. Malik hesitated, then gave a small nod. Richard rummaged through the fridge, pulling out leftover pasta and heating it up. Malik sat at the counter, still clutching his ball. When Richard set the plate in front of him, the boy stared for a second before digging in, eating so fast it broke Richard's heart. "Slow down," he said gently. "There's plenty." Malik froze, as if the idea of plenty was foreign to him. He nodded and tried to pace himself. As the boy ate, Richard leaned against the counter, studying him. "Where have you been staying?" he asked carefully. Malik shrugged, his mouth full. "Here and there." Richard frowned. "On the streets." Malik's eyes flickered with defiance. "I can take care of myself." The billionaire sighed, realizing how much pride the boy carried despite everything. He didn't want to push too hard, but he couldn't ignore the truth. When the plate was empty, Malik leaned back, looking more tired than he wanted to admit. Richard gestured toward the guest bedroom. "You can sleep there tonight. The bed's big, soft. You'll like it." Malik shook his head immediately. "I don't need a bed. I'll sleep on the floor. I'm fine." Richard crouched to meet his eyes. "You've done enough surviving. Just this once, let yourself rest." Malik hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. That night, as Malik finally drifted off under warm blankets, Richard stood at the doorway watching him. The boy looked younger in sleep, his face peaceful, the weight of the world briefly lifted. Richard's chest tightened. He thought of his own childhood, how he had grown up with everything money could buy. Yet here was this boy, fighting, surviving, protecting strangers, with nothing. He whispered to himself, "What have I been doing with my life?" The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Malik stirred, blinking at the softness around him. For a moment he looked lost, as if he'd woken up in a dream. Richard appeared at the door holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa. Malik sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Never had that before," he admitted, pointing to the drink. Richard smiled. "First time for everything." Malik took a cautious sip and his eyes widened at the sweetness. For the first time, Richard saw a real smile spread across his face, and it lit up the room. But the peace didn't last. Later that afternoon, as Richard checked the news, his stomach dropped. Headlines screamed about the attack. Reporters had already learned that the billionaire had been ambushed in an alley. Security cameras nearby had caught parts of the fight, The boy, the ball, the thugs running. The story was spreading fast. Mystery child saves billionaire. Richard glanced at Malik, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor bouncing the ball softly. The boy had no idea that the world was already talking about him. Richard's phone buzzed non-stop, calls from business partners, bodyguards, even the police. Everyone wanted answers, but Richard's thoughts weren't on them. They were on Malik. If the thugs saw the news, they might come back for revenge. And Malik, brave as he was, couldn't face the world alone. Richard knew what he had to do. He turned off his phone and sat beside Malik. "You know," Richard said quietly, "the world thinks you're a hero." Malik shrugged. "Eyes still on the ball. Heroes don't exist. Not where I come from." Richard's chest tightened again. He wanted to argue, but he realized Malik truly believed it. "Maybe," Richard said slowly, "but you're proof they can." Malik glanced up at him, uncertain, almost afraid to believe. And Richard, for the first time in years, felt a purpose far greater than money or power. He felt the call to protect, to give back, to change a life that had already changed his. That evening, Richard sat by the window of his penthouse, staring at the city skyline while Malik dribbled the ball softly across the polished floor. The sound echoed, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Richard's mind spun. For decades, he had measured life by wealth, success, and status. Yet, in one night, a boy with nothing had given him something money could never buy: perspective. His phone buzzed again. This time it was his head of security, insisting he file a report, hire more guards, tighten his movements. Richard almost laughed. None of those things had saved him in that alley. A boy with scraped knees and a battered ball had. He turned off the phone once more. Malik looked up curiously. "Why don't you answer?" Richard shrugged. "Because none of that matters right now." Later, when Malik yawned and curled up on the couch despite the guest bed waiting for him, Richard covered him with a blanket. The boy's tiny figure seemed lost against the vast couch, and Richard felt a pang in his chest. He had properties across the world, art worth millions, cars he never even drove. Yet here was this boy who clung only to a ball. He whispered to himself, "I can change this. I have to." The next day, Richard took Malik out, disguising him in a hoodie and cap to avoid the press. They ate breakfast at a small diner, the kind of place Richard hadn't stepped into in years. Malik devoured pancakes, his eyes lighting up with every bite. Richard watched, smiling. "Like it?" he asked. Malik nodded, cheeks full. "Best thing I ever ate." Richard chuckled, shaking his head at how such a simple thing could bring so much joy. After breakfast, they walked through a nearby park. Children played ball games, families laughed, and Malik slowed, watching them. His grip on his ball tightened. Richard noticed the longing in his eyes. "Did you ever play with other kids?" he asked softly. Malik shrugged. "Sometimes. But mostly, I play alone." Richard's heart sank. A boy this strong, this brave, should have been playing freely, not fighting to survive. They sat on a bench, and Richard finally asked what had weighed on him since that night. "Malik, do you want to stay with me? Not just for one night. For good." The boy froze, staring at him wide-eyed. "Stay? Like live here?" Richard nodded. "Yes. I can give you safety, a home, school, everything you deserve." Malik's face hardened, suspicion flashing in his eyes. "Why? You don't even know me." Richard leaned forward, his voice steady. "Because you saved me when no one else would. Because you're stronger than anyone I've ever met. And because I don't want to go back to my old life without you in it." For a long moment, Malik said nothing. He bounced the ball against the ground, staring at it. Then his voice cracked, quiet but raw. "People always say things they don't mean. Then they leave." Richard's chest ached at the words. He reached out, gently placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "I'm not leaving. Not this time. I promise." The boy's eyes searched his, looking for any sign of a lie. Finally, slowly, Malik nodded. "Okay, but if you break your promise." His small voice carried a weight beyond his years. Richard shook his head firmly. "I won't." From that day forward, their lives began to change. Richard kept Malik close, enrolling him in school, hiring tutors, making sure he had everything he needed, but never letting him forget where he came from. Malik still carried his ball everywhere, dribbling it in hallways, tossing it against walls, always keeping it near. It wasn't just a toy. It was a symbol of the night he chose courage over fear, of the strength that defined him. The press eventually discovered Malik's identity, but Richard shielded him, turning the story into one of hope rather than spectacle. "This boy is more than a hero," he told reporters. "He's family." The words shocked everyone, but Richard meant them. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a billionaire. He was a guardian, a father figure, someone who finally understood what it meant to love without conditions. Months later, one evening after dinner, Malik stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The lights sparkled like stars beneath them. He turned to Richard, his ball tucked under his arm. "You know," Malik said softly, "that night, I thought I was saving you. But maybe you saved me too." Richard swallowed hard, his eyes misting. He walked over, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "No, Malik. We saved each other." And under the glow of the city, a billionaire who once thought money was everything and a boy who had nothing but a ball stood side by side, knowing they had found the one thing both of them had been missing all along: family. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe now for more incredible stories that inspire, shock, and touch the heart. Don't miss the next one.